My name is Walter Kane, and I am 68 years old. At my own 70th birthday dinner, my son-in-law stood up in front of 40 guests, raised his glass, and called me a charity case with a smile on his face. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, is that I owned the building they were sitting in. Before I tell you how that evening ended, I need you to understand something first. The deepest wounds aren't the ones that bleed. They're the quiet ones. The ones that open so slowly, you almost don't notice until you're already hollow. My daughter Claire was the last great thing that Margaret and I built together. Not a building, not a company, not a portfolio, a person. A girl who used to climb the oak tree in our backyard and read out loud to the squirrels because she said they looked lonely. A girl who cried at the end of every movie, even the ones with happy endings, because she said she was sad the story was over. That was Claire. That was who she was before Brandon Ellsworth walked into her life and started quietly sanding down every beautiful thing about her until she fit the shape he needed. Margaret passed 6 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, which the doctors told us was almost a mercy, but I can tell you there is nothing merciful about watching the person you have loved for 41 years become a stranger in their own body over the course of a single autumn. When she was gone, the house on Birchwood Lane went silent in a way I had never experienced in my entire life. Not quiet silent. The difference matters. Quiet is peaceful. Silent is a held breath. Silent is a room that used to have music in it. After Margaret died, I made changes. Real ones. I had spent 30 years building Kane Infrastructure Group from 2 worn-out dump trucks and a handshake loan into one of the largest private construction and property management companies in the state. By the time I stepped back, we had commercial holdings across 7 cities, a few hundred employees, and more zeros on the balance sheet than I ever stopped to count. None of it meant anything standing in that silent house. So I handed the operational reins to my board, and I moved. Not far, just 20 minutes outside the city. I bought a small craftsman cottage on a gravel road near a pond, and I started living the kind of life that didn't require a tie. I drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with a crack in the windshield that I kept meaning to fix. I wore flannels and work boots. I grew tomatoes. I read books on the porch in the evenings, and I talked to Margaret's photograph before I went to sleep. People looked at me and filled in the blanks. An older man in worn clothes driving a beat-up truck, the story writes itself in people's minds. I let them write it. It served a purpose. A purpose I will explain in a moment. Brandon Ellsworth entered Claire's life about 4 years ago, 8 months after Margaret passed. He was 34, polished in the way that certain men are polished, all surface and no depth, the kind of shine that comes from wanting people to look at you rather than from actually having anything to look at. He worked in private equity, or he said he did. He had opinions about wine and knew the names of architects and dropped them into conversation like breadcrumbs leading back to himself. The first time I met him, he arrived at my cottage in a car that cost more than most people's houses, looked around my living room with a smile that was trying to be warm, and said, "This is charming, sir." Very rustic. The way he said rustic told me everything. Not a description, a verdict. Still, I watched and waited. I had learned patience the hard way, through years of negotiations that stretched over months and contracts that had to be read 3 times before you signed them. I extended the same patience to my daughter's new relationship. I gave it room to prove me wrong. It started proving me right almost immediately. 2 months in, Claire called me on a Sunday afternoon, her voice bright in that particular way it gets when she's nervous about something. "Daddy, Brandon has this amazing opportunity to go to Napa with some of his clients. The thing is, it's next weekend, and he's a little short this month, and I was wondering if maybe you could help out with the flights." I sent the money. Of course I did. It was a small amount, and she was my daughter, and I believed, at the time, that I was helping her. But that was the first thread. And once you pull the first thread, others follow. 3 weeks later, it was tickets to a charity gala, $1,500, because Brandon wanted to be seen at a particular table with a particular crowd. Then it was a deposit on a lease for a new apartment, because his current place, as Claire carefully explained, wasn't quite the right address for where Brandon needed to be professionally. Then it was a contribution toward a custom suit, because he had an important meeting coming up, and presentation mattered in his world. Each request arrived through Claire, wrapped in the gentle language of necessity, seasoned with just enough of her own voice to make it feel like a conversation rather than an invoice. I kept a quiet record in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Not out of suspicion, exactly out of habit. I had built a company by writing things down. The notebook filled faster than I expected. What changed things, what shifted the ground under my feet permanently, was the conversation I overheard on a Thursday evening in my own kitchen. They had come for dinner I cooked, because I always cooked, and after we ate, I stepped out to the back porch to get more firewood. Through the screen door, I heard Brandon's voice. He didn't know I was still within earshot. His tone had changed. The warmth was gone, the careful deference that he always performed around me. He was speaking quietly, but with a confidence that had no room for doubt in it. The old man sitting on a dead estate, he said. Whatever he had, he burned through it when he retired. That truck alone tells you everything you need to know. But your grandmother's ring is worth something. And eventually the property. I didn't hear the rest because the blood in my ears got loud. Not from anger, from clarity. The peculiar, cold, floor-clearing kind of clarity that only comes when something you suspected turns out to be absolutely true. I stood there in the dark for a long moment with a piece of firewood in each hand. Then I walked back inside, set the wood by the fireplace, and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. I smiled through the rest of the evening. I am very good at smiling through things. 40 years in business will teach you that. After they left, I went to my desk, and I called Sandra Marsh. Sandra had been my attorney for 27 years. Before that, she had been my father's attorney, which meant she had known me since I was barely old enough to understand what a contract was. She was sharp, private, relentlessly competent, and she had a gift for silence that I have always respected deeply, the ability to listen completely before saying a single word. When she answered, it was late. I apologized. She told me not to be ridiculous and to talk. I told her about Brandon, about the pattern of requests, about what I had overheard, and then I told her the thing I had been thinking about since Margaret died, the thing I had let sit in the back of my mind like a plan waiting for a reason. I want to activate the structure, I said. There was a pause on her end. She knew what I meant. We had built it together, years ago, after Margaret got sick, after I saw clearly what can happen to a family's legacy when the wrong people start circling it. We had worked with a team of estate attorneys, financial planners, and trust specialists over the course of a long winter. And what we built was not dramatic, and it was not simple. It was simply sound, permanent, invisible from the outside. Every meaningful asset I owned, the controlling interest in Kane Infrastructure Group, the real estate holdings across the state, the commercial properties, the investment accounts, had been transferred into an irrevocable trust years ago. The Margaret Kane Legacy Trust. I was its administrator and its primary beneficiary. But I personally, as Walter Kane, the private citizen who drove a cracked windshield truck and grew tomatoes, owned almost nothing that appeared in any public record. What Brandon believed he was marrying his way toward did not exist. At least, not in any form he could touch. But activating the structure meant more than just maintaining that shield. It meant going on offense. Understood, Sandra said. I'll put the team together in the morning. Over the next several weeks, her firm's investigators were thorough and quiet. What they found about Brandon Ellsworth painted a picture that was both familiar and worse than I had imagined. His private equity firm was a single-room operation that hadn't closed a real deal in 2 years. His personal credit was overextended. He had borrowed against a piece of property he no longer had clear title to, and had 2 pending civil judgments that hadn't yet surfaced publicly. He was, underneath the suits and the car and the particular confidence of a man who had spent his whole life performing solvency, completely underwater. He wasn't marrying Claire because he loved her. He was marrying the idea of what he assumed would be attached to her eventually, and he was counting down the days. I told none of this to Claire. I tried once, gently, in the way a father tries when he knows a conversation can go wrong. I said I had some concerns about Brandon's financial situation, that I had heard some things, that I just wanted her to have a clear picture before they got more serious. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something embarrassing at a dinner party. Patient. A little sad. "Daddy," she said, "Brandon warned me you might do this. He said you'd have a hard time letting go." She reached over and patted my hand. "It's okay. I understand. He had gotten there before me. Of course he had." I went home and sat in the chair where I used to sit with Margaret on Sunday mornings, and I stayed very still for a long time. The hurt of that moment was specific and located not in my chest, the way grief usually lives, but somewhere behind my eyes. That was my daughter reaching over and patting my hand and telling me I was just an old man who couldn't let go. That was a verdict, spoken softly, with love, that still landed like a sentence. The engagement was announced 3 months later. What followed was the kind of slow-motion unraveling that I imagine only a parent can fully recognize. The requests for money increased in frequency and shifted in scale. Brandon now spoke to me directly, the deference mostly gone, a new familiarity replacing it that I was not sure was affection or ownership. He called me Wally. Nobody had ever called me Wally. I let it go. The wedding planning began, and with it came the planning meeting that I will remember for the rest of my life. They invited me to lunch at a restaurant Brandon had chosen, a downtown place with exposed brick and a menu that didn't list prices because the kind of people who ate there were assumed not to care. He arrived with a leather portfolio that he set on the table like a man laying out a property map. Claire sat beside him, quiet, tracing the rim of her water glass. The wedding, he explained, was going to be a statement. He said the word statement, without any self-consciousness whatsoever. He had already reserved a venue, the Hargrove Estate, a restored Victorian property north of the city, and had contacted a planner whose minimum package started at $300,000. He outlined the guest list. 200 people, mostly his contacts. He mentioned a caterer flown in from New York, a florist from Chicago, a jazz quartet. He slid the portfolio across to me. Inside was an itemized list. My eyes moved down it without rushing. Venue deposit, $40,000. Catering, $65,000. Flowers, $22,000. Music, $18,000. Photography and video, $15,000. The bottom line was $280,000, presented not as a request, but as a courtesy notification. I looked at Claire. She was still tracing the rim of her glass. "I have a different idea," I said. Brandon smiled the smile of a man who has already decided that whatever I was about to say would be declined. I told him that I had a connection to the Ashford Hotel downtown, that I had some history with the property, and that I could arrange the venue at no cost as my gift to them. I told him it was a beautiful building, that the ballroom had original hardwood and 12-foot ceilings, and that I could promise him it would be the most impressive room his guests had ever sat in. He listened to the whole thing with that smile in place. Then he said, "That's really thoughtful of you, Walter. Genuinely. But the Ashford is, it's a little dated, isn't it? The Hargrove is what our guests are going to expect." Claire said nothing. "Our guests?" I repeated. "I just mean it's going to be a high-profile event," he said. "We need to match that energy." I closed the portfolio and pushed it back across the table. I told them I would think about it. He took that to mean yes. I could see it in the way his shoulders settled. I paid for lunch, as I always did, and I drove home in my old truck, and I called Gerald Paxton from the driveway. Gerald had been my closest friend for 35 years. We had started out as competitors, two young developers in the same market, fighting for the same contracts, and somewhere in the middle of all that friction, we had developed the kind of respect that eventually becomes friendship. He was louder than me, bigger in every room, impossible to overlook. He still ran his firm actively, and his name opened doors in this city the way a master key opens a building. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to call in a favor," I said. He didn't ask what for. Gerald had known me long enough to understand that those 4 words meant something real. "Name it," he said. I told him about Brandon, about the requests, about the investigation Sandra's team had completed. About the meeting that afternoon and the portfolio and the way my daughter had sat beside this man and said nothing while he presented me with a bill for a wedding he had designed to impress people I had never met. I told him about the evening I had stood on the back porch with 2 pieces of firewood in my hands and heard myself described as a dead estate. When I finished, Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That son of a," and stopped himself. "What do you need?" "My birthday?" I said. "The dinner next month. I need you there. And when the moment comes, I need you to stand up." He understood. The birthday dinner was Brandon's idea, which in retrospect should have told me everything about how the evening was going to go. He said he wanted to do something special for my 70th, which had already passed the previous year without much fanfare because I had been traveling, and he framed it as a gift to me from him and Claire. He chose the restaurant. He chose the guest list, which included his parents, several of his colleagues and their spouses, and a handful of people I barely knew. He gave me a time and an address and told me to arrive a few minutes early. The restaurant was called Meridian. It occupied the street level of a historic commercial building in the Arts District, all warm light and walnut paneling, the kind of place that feels expensive the moment you walk through the door. I had eaten there once, about 2 years prior, shortly after my property management company had quietly acquired the building through a subsidiary holding. I arrived early as instructed. I was wearing clean slacks and a button-down shirt, not a suit, just what I wear when I make an effort. Several of Brandon's colleagues were already there when I arrived, people I had never met, talking amongst themselves with the loose energy of people at a corporate event. They looked up when I walked in, took me in briefly, and returned to their conversations. I found my seat. It was at the far end of the table, the end near the kitchen, angled slightly away from the main gathering as if placed there as an afterthought. I sat down and ordered water, and I watched the room fill. Claire arrived, looking beautiful and tired at the same time. The way she had started looking since she and Brandon moved in together, lovely on the surface and somehow smaller underneath it. She hugged me and told me I looked great. Brandon arrived 3 minutes later, working the room immediately, shaking hands with the grip of a man who practices, touching shoulders, deploying the big laugh. He got to me last. He clapped me on the back with the force of a man demonstrating his strength. "Wally, the man of the hour." Dinner was fine. I ate, and I listened, and I asked questions of the people near me, and I was the thing I have always been in rooms like this. Present, attentive, invisible. Brandon's colleagues talked about markets and deals and recent trips. His parents sat mid-table looking prosperous. Claire smiled at everything. And then Brandon stood up. He tapped his glass with his knife, a gesture he had clearly rehearsed, and the table quieted. He was the kind of person who assumes rooms will quiet for him, and they generally do, which only makes the assumption worse. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to talk about my father-in-law, Walter Kane." He gestured toward me, and several people turned. Most of you know that Walter and I have had some time to get to know each other over the past few years, and I have to say, he is one of a kind. Light laughter from the colleagues who assumed this was a warm-up. Walter is, and I say this with complete affection, he is the most stubbornly simple man I have ever met. He paused for the laugh. It came, this is a man who drives a truck that I genuinely believe is older than some of my colleagues. A man who, when Claire and I offered to help update his cottage, "I'm sorry, I have to call it what it is," he looked at us like we'd suggested burning it down. More laughter. Claire was looking at the table. "But in all seriousness," Brandon continued, shifting to a tone of practiced gravity, "Claire and I have been having some real conversations lately about family, about responsibility, about the future, and I want everyone here tonight to know that as we look ahead, we are committed to making sure Walter is taken care of." He looked directly at me, his eyes warm with a performance of sincerity. "We found a wonderful community up in Lakeview Hills. It's really more of a resort than a retirement home. Walter, I promise you, and we think it would be a perfect fit. Active social life, professionals who can help with day-to-day needs, all the time in the world to relax." He lifted his glass. "So, to Walter Kane, may the next chapter be your most comfortable one." Half the table raised their glasses. A few people smiled at me with the particular kind of sympathy people offer the elderly when someone is being generous on their behalf. I did not move. I sat at the far end of the table with my hands resting flat on the white tablecloth, and I looked at my son-in-law as he sat back down with the satisfaction of a man who has just executed a plan. I looked at my daughter. She was turned slightly to the side, her jaw tight, and I understood in that moment that she had known this was coming and had said nothing, had done nothing. I had given her every chance. I had tried to reach her gently, carefully, the way you try to reach someone standing at the edge of something with patience, with softness, not wanting to startle them into the thing you're trying to pull them back from. She had looked at me, every time, with Brandon's words in her mouth, Brandon's assessment in her eyes. That night, at the far end of that table, watching my daughter choose her silence one final time, the last patient corner of my heart converted itself to something colder and much more precise. I picked up my water glass and I took a slow, deliberate sip. I set it down. I looked at Gerald Paxton, who was sitting mid-table on the opposite side, watching me with the calm of a man who has been waiting for his signal. I gave the smallest of nods. Gerald set down his fork. He was not a subtle man by nature, and he understood that this was not a moment for subtlety. He pushed back his chair and stood to his full height. He was a large man, Gerald, the kind whose physical presence in a room can redirect a conversation by itself. And he looked down the table at Brandon with an expression I had only seen him wear in boardrooms, when someone had said something he found both stupid and offensive. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Gerald said, in a voice that did not sound remotely sorry. "But I have a few things I'd like to add to this tribute." Brandon looked up with an indulgent smile. "Gerald, by all means." "Brandon," Gerald said his name the way you say a wrong answer. "Do you know who this man is?" A beat of silence. "That's Walter Kane." Gerald let it land. He founded Kane Infrastructure Group 30 years ago with nothing but a couple of trucks and a willingness to outwork everyone in the room. His firm has built or renovated approximately 400 commercial properties in this state. He has employed, at various points in the last 3 decades, close to 1,000 people. Gerald picked up his glass but did not drink from it. "The building we are currently sitting in, that's one of his." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of the evening. It had texture, weight. Brandon's smile had not disappeared yet. It was trying to recalibrate, searching for an angle that still worked. "Gerald, I think there might be some confusion." "There's no confusion," Gerald said. He sat back down, unhurried, and picked up his fork. "I just thought people should know who they were toasting." 40 faces turned toward me, some curious, some uncertain, a few visibly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the dynamic at this table. Brandon was looking at me across the length of the table, and I could see the exact moment the performance dropped. His face went careful in the way faces go careful when the body recognizes danger before the mind has caught up. "That's Wally. We never discussed anything about." He stopped, started again, looked at Claire. Claire was staring at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Not the compliance I had expected, something more fractured than that. Something that looked, for the first time in a long time, like the beginning of a question. I didn't raise my voice. I had never needed to raise my voice to be heard by the people who mattered. "Brandon," I said, "I owe you a conversation. I've been meaning to have it for a while." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and produced a single folded document. I set it on the table in front of me. "But I thought we should finish dinner first. Sandra has prepared a summary of some things that I think will be relevant to you both. My attorney will be joining us shortly." "Your attorney?" He said it the way you repeat something that hasn't made sense yet. "She's just going to clarify a few points," I said. "It won't take long." Sandra arrived 12 minutes later, as we had arranged. She came through the restaurant's front door in a dark suit, carrying a thin briefcase, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has done high-stakes things in formal settings. So many times it no longer registers as remarkable. She nodded to me, introduced herself to the table, and set her briefcase on the service stand near the corner. "I apologize for the intrusion on the evening," she said, without any particular apology in her voice. "I'll be brief." What followed was brief. Sandra was good at brief. She had once settled a $14 million dispute in a conference call that lasted 11 minutes, and I had been awed by it then, and I was awed by it now. She explained, in plain and direct language, that Walter Kane's personal assets, his house, his truck, his modest checking account, represented the full and complete picture of Walter Kane's personal financial standing. She explained that this was entirely deliberate, and had been for years. She explained that the significant holdings formerly associated with Kane Infrastructure Group had been transferred, years prior, into the Margaret Kane Legacy Trust, an irrevocable instrument that named specific charitable beneficiaries for each major asset upon Walter's passing. The house on the gravel road near the pond. She explained the cottage that Brandon had planned to renovate and inhabit was not Walter's personal property. It had been held in trust for 6 years. Upon Walter's death, it would transfer immediately and permanently to a land conservation organization that Margaret had supported during her lifetime. There was no estate to marry toward. There was no inheritance waiting at the end of a very calculated patience. There was a man who lived simply and genuinely in a house his wife had loved, driving a truck he had no particular desire to replace, and every dollar of what he had built in his working life was already spoken for, in documents signed and witnessed and filed in a courthouse, directed toward the things that had mattered to the woman who had shared 41 years with him. Brandon's face, across the table, had gone through several things in quick succession. Disbelief, recalculation, something that might have been the start of an argument. Then a stillness that was not calm, but was the thing that comes just before a person understands they have lost. Sandra set a second document on the table, a summary of his firm's financial position, prepared by the forensic accounting team. She didn't read it out loud. She let the number at the bottom, the gap between what he owed and what he had, speak for itself to the people close enough to see it. "I'm sharing this not to embarrass anyone," Sandra said, which was generous given what she had just done, "but because I believe that transparency, at this stage, is more valuable than continued misunderstanding." She closed her briefcase. Walter has no wish to create hardship. He does, however, have every intention of protecting the legacy he built with his wife. She looked at Brandon with the directness of someone who has been in rooms with worse men than him and has never blinked. "I'd strongly advise consulting your own counsel before making any further decisions about the direction of this family." She nodded once to the table, to me, to Claire, and then she walked out. The restaurant held its breath. Brandon's father, who had been the model of paternal pride all evening, was looking at the tablecloth. His mother had both hands wrapped around her wine glass, as if it were a life preserver. The colleagues were performing a studied interest in their food. I looked at my son-in-law and felt none of the things I might have expected. No triumph, no cruelty. Something quieter than either of those. The deep, settled exhale of a man who has carried a heavy thing a long distance and has finally been able to set it down. "Brandon," I said, "I don't know how much of what you told Claire about me was deliberate and how much of it you actually believed. I don't know if it matters now. But I want you to understand something. I kept my voice even and low, the way Margaret used to keep her voice when she said the truest things. I would have given you everything, not the trust, not the holdings. You were never going to have those regardless, but everything that a father can give a son-in-law who genuinely loved his daughter. My time, my experience, my guidance, all of it, freely, because she chose you." I paused. "But you didn't want any of that. You wanted the ledger. You wanted the number at the bottom, and in trying to get to that number, you lost the only thing in this family that was ever actually yours." I looked at Claire. She was crying without sound, the way she used to cry at the end of movies when she was small, with her whole face turned inward. I had one more thing to say, and I knew it was the hardest thing I had ever needed to say to her. Harder than any conversation about Margaret's diagnosis. Harder than any truth I had delivered in 40 years of negotiation. "Claire," she looked up, "I love you without condition. I will love you without condition until the day I die. That is not something you have to earn back, and it is not something you can lose." I held her eyes. "But love doesn't mean there are no consequences. You sat beside this man and you watched him make his plans and you stayed quiet. Not once. Every time. I watched the words reach her. When you are ready to talk, not to explain, not to defend, just to talk honestly, you know where I live. The door is open, but I will not come to you. Not this time. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. I stopped at the host stand on my way out and asked the young woman there to please ensure that the kitchen and service staff received a full evening's bonus from the house, effective tonight, and to put it under the management account. She looked a little surprised, but said, of course. I thanked her by name, she had a tag, and I walked out into the November air. Gerald caught up with me at the corner. He didn't say anything immediately. We stood there for a moment watching the street, two old men in decent shoes, not talking. Well, he finally said. Yeah, I said. He walked me to my truck. We shook hands in the old way, the way we had been shaking hands for 35 years, and he held on for a second longer than necessary, the way you hold on when there are no more words that are the right size. I drove home on the highway, with the window down and the cold air coming in, and the radio playing something I didn't recognize. By the time I reached the gravel road, the silence that met me was a different kind from the one that had lived in this house since Margaret died. Less like a held breath, more like something completing. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, and I talked to her, the way I do sometimes. Not quite a prayer, and not quite a conversation, but something in between. I told her what had happened, and I told her I thought I had handled it the way she would have wanted, not cruelly, not from ego, but from the place where self-respect and love and the refusal to be erased all live in the same quiet corner. I asked her what she thought. The pond didn't answer, but it was still, and the stillness was a kind of answer, and I was grateful for it. That was 8 months ago. Last Sunday, Claire came to the house. She drove herself, and she came alone and she knocked on the door the way she used to knock when she was a teenager, and she knew she had done something she needed to own up to. Not timid, not demanding, just present, waiting. I opened the door, and I looked at my daughter. She looked like herself, maybe for the first time in years. The costume was gone, not the clothes, just the performance of being someone else's idea of a person. She said, I'm not here to ask for anything. I know, I said. I just wanted to see where you are. I'm right here, I said. Same as always. I made coffee. We sat on the porch. We didn't talk about Brandon, who she was in the process of separating from, or the apartment, or the next chapter of her practical life. We talked about Margaret. We talked about the oak tree in the backyard of the old house and the squirrels and the way the story ending always made her cry. We talked for 3 hours, and when she left, she hugged me the way she used to hug me when she was still the girl in that backyard, with her whole self in it. I stood in the doorway and watched her drive down the gravel road, and I thought about the thing Margaret used to tell me in the early years of the company, when the risk was real and the margins were thin, and I sometimes lay awake running numbers in the dark. She used to say, you can't build anything that lasts if you're not willing to clear the ground first. I believed her then. I believe her still. There is a version of this story where I am the villain, where a father uses his wealth and his planning and his long patience as weapons against his daughter and her choices. I want to be honest with you about that version, because I have sat with it. I have turned it over. I have asked myself, in the long quiet of that cottage, whether what I did was an act of protection or an act of control, dressed in the language of principle. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure there is one. What I know is this. I was not willing to be erased. I was not willing to be folded up and sent away to a comfortable room somewhere to wait for an ending that had been planned for me by a man who saw my life as an obstacle to his ambitions. I was not willing to let my daughter learn, at great and permanent cost, that love is something you optimize for rather than something you choose. And I was not willing to let the thing that Margaret and I built together, not the money, not the properties, but the spirit behind them, the belief that you build for something larger than yourself, get swallowed by a man who saw it only as inventory. Maybe that makes me calculating. Maybe it makes me cold. I've been called worse things by better men. But here is what I have also learned. In the months since that November evening, in the slow returning of my daughter to herself and to me, the strongest structures are not the ones that never get tested. They're the ones that get tested and hold. and are still standing when the weather clears. That's true of buildings. It is true, I believe, of families. It is true. If you will allow an old man one more piece of unsolicited wisdom, of the kind of love that is worth having, don't mistake your patience for weakness. Don't mistake your silence for peace. And don't ever let anyone, not a son-in-law, not a stranger, not even someone you love, convince you that who you are is determined by what you appear to have. The ground you're standing on is yours. Know what it's built on. And know, always, where the foundation is. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story from a single glance? And how long did you wait before you let them find out how wrong they were?